I'm Alivia, and today I want to give you 5 great beginner Japanese podcasts to use for listening comprehension. And if you have any podcast recommendations of your own, let us know down in the comments. So when you're learning a new language, it's really important to dedicate a lot of time to listening to the language. Listening comprehension is really a skill that you're going to have to build up over a lot of time, and by putting in a lot of practice, it's not going to happen overnight. Listening is also a key way to actually learn the language. Think of when you were a baby, you weren't studying out of textbooks or doing vocab flashcards. You simply had someone who was talking to you every day, and over time you learned the language, and eventually you were able to speak it on your own. But if you're like me and you don't have the opportunity to be surrounded by people who speak Japanese, you're going to have to substitute that using Japanese media. Podcasts are a really great way to do this because you don't have to be watching something in order to do it. You can put on a podcast while you're driving to work, while you're doing chores. It's something that you can put on in the background while you're doing other things. So it's a really great way to squeeze in listening comprehension in a really busy day. So today I'm going to give you 5 podcast recommendations that are good for beginners, and I'm going to order them in generally the order I recommend that you listen to them in, but I think it's really important to be listening to a variety of sources, both in speed and in the difficulty level. So you don't have to literally only listen to one podcast before moving to the next. Try to mix in some of the harder ones as well to get some practice in. So the first podcast is the Konichiwa podcast. So this podcast is bilingual, so the hosts talk in both Japanese and English, and they switch between the two throughout the podcast. 2 of the hosts are native Japanese speakers, and the third one is an American who has been living in Japan for many years. I think this podcast is a good starting place if the thought of listening to a full Japanese podcast is too overwhelming, because having them switch back and forth between Japanese and English means that even if you don't understand what's being said in Japanese, you'll understand the context and know what the topic is from the English parts. They talk about a really wide range of interesting topics, usually centering around life in Japan or current events, and the episodes range from 20 to 30 minutes long. Podcast number 2 is Sakura Tips, and this podcast is definitely the easiest full Japanese podcast on this list because the speaker talks really slowly, takes lots of pauses, and there's a full Japanese transcript as well as English translations for every episode. So you can read that transcript either before you read, during, or after to figure out what's going on and find new words. And the reason I didn't list this as the first podcast is because I think it's really important to make sure you have some exposure to natural Japanese language that is spoken at a regular pace first. Because I think if this podcast is your first time practicing listening comprehension, you might have an unrealistic idea of how the language sounds and what the pace and rhythm is like. And you might pick up some bad habits if you aren't able to recognize that the speaker is talking in a very exaggerated and slow way so that beginners can understand. So once you do have an understanding of what regular speech sounds like, this is a really good podcast if speed is something that you're struggling with and you find most podcasts are talking too fast for you. And then you can also have those transcripts to help your understanding. These podcasts are also relatively short, so you can listen to almost all of them in 5 minutes or less. Podcast number 3 is Japanese for Beginners, also known as Nihongo Kon Teppei. And it took me forever to realize that the kon is Spanish, which means with, so it means Japanese with teppei. I assumed that the whole title was Japanese and I just couldn't figure out what that word was. The host is Japanese, but he also speaks Spanish, so he usually ends the podcast with a hasta luego. But other than that, the podcast is in Japanese. And he speaks at a fairly natural pace, so it'll be faster than the last podcast. But the good thing about these is that they're all really short, so this is really good for your first full Japanese regular paced podcast because it's going to be hard to pay attention to something that you don't fully understand, especially without visual cues. So it's great that they're nice and short. He also has a second podcast by the same name that looks like this, but this one is specifically for intermediate learners, and the one that you're looking for looks like this. Podcast number 3 is a newer podcast called Japanese with Shun, and the main feature of this podcast is that he only uses grammar structures that are found in Geiki 1. So he's very cognizant of the type of sentences that he's saying. He talks slower than Japanese podcasts for beginners, but faster than Sakura Tips. So while I think it's really important to be practicing with people who are speaking at a regular pace, this podcast is a really good bridge if you're struggling to keep up. And all of these episodes are 10 minutes or less, but the last minute or so is a vocabulary list. So he'll repeat any difficult words or phrases that were used in the episode and then say what they mean in English. And now the final podcast is Japanese with Noriko, and this is definitely the hardest podcast on my list. The host talks a little bit fast and doesn't oversimplify her language. Sometimes she'll have guests come on so you can listen to their conversation, and many of her episodes also have Japanese transcripts. So you can go to her website and read along and find any words that are new to you. And the length of her episodes range a lot, anywhere from 5 to 30 minutes. So you can always find one that will work for you. Now remember, when you first start listening to podcasts, you're not going to understand anything for a while. Podcasts are a lot harder than watching TV or YouTube because you don't have any visual cues to let you know what's going on. It's all audio. But podcasts are a lot easier to squeeze into your day if you don't have time to sit down and watch something. So if you want to improve your Japanese quickly, I really recommend trying to squeeze in podcasts wherever you can. During your commute, when you're working out, out, doing chores, anything where you would normally be listening to music, try putting on a Japanese podcast. Listening comprehension takes practice and time, so if you're able to pick out even one word, you should be really proud of yourself. Now, if you have any podcast recommendations of your own, let us know down in the comments. And that is all I have for today, and I'll see you soon.